The Grand Conclave of Irathven was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy. And on this particular day, every seat in its vast amphitheater was filled with beings who had traveled across star systems to witness what they all believed would be the political humiliation of the newest species to join their ranks. Humanity had been admitted to the conclave only 11 standard months ago, and already the whispers had not stopped, not even for a single day since their arrival, because the story of how humans had first made contact with the wider galaxy was not a gentle one, and it made the elder races deeply uncomfortable in ways they struggled to put into words. 3 Dominion patrol ships had intercepted a small human exploration vessel near the outer rim, and what should have been a simple detainment had turned into something no one could explain, because the humans had not destroyed those ships. And that was the part that frightened people the most, because destroying enemy vessels was something every species understood. But the humans had instead crippled all 3 with a precision so surgical that not a single crew member died. And every system was disabled in exactly the right order to leave the ships floating and helpless but perfectly intact, as if the humans had taken them apart like a child pulling the wings off a toy and then carefully setting it back down. Ambassador Ilara Voss sat in the human delegation's modest alcove on the lower tier of the amphitheater, her posture straight and her expression carrying the kind of calm that made other diplomats nervous, because it was not the calm of someone who did not understand the danger she was in, but rather the calm of someone who understood it completely and had already made her decisions about how to respond. She was a tall woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back and eyes that never seemed to blink at the right times, and the alien diplomats who had interacted with her over the past months had developed a quiet consensus that she was either the most brilliant negotiator humanity had ever produced or the most reckless, and none of them could agree on which one it was. The matter before the conclave today was a territorial dispute, and on the surface it was simple enough, because humanity had begun colonizing a mineral-rich system on the edge of contested space, a system called Verath IV that had been catalogued but never claimed, and the Torvan hegemony had decided that this was unacceptable. The Torvan were not a species that anyone in the galaxy took lightly, and for very good reason, because they were apex predators from a high-gravity death world where everything evolved to kill everything else, and they had risen to the top of that food chain through a combination of raw physical dominance and a cultural obsession with martial supremacy that had been refined over 10,000 years of recorded history. Their representative today was not merely an ambassador, but the hegemon himself, Culver the Undying, a title he had earned by surviving more than 300 ritual duels across 6 decades of rule, and he sat in the upper tier surrounded by his honor guard of elite warriors, each one standing over 8 feet tall with chitinous armor plating that covered their bodies like living shields and 4 arms that ended in claws capable of shearing through starship hull plating. Culver rose to speak, and the entire amphitheater fell silent, not out of respect but out of the simple biological reality that when a 9-foot predator with mandibles the size of a human forearm stood up in a room, every prey instinct in every species present fired at once. His voice was deep and resonant, and carried the clicking undertones of the Torvan language even through the translation matrix as he declared that humanity had no right to Verath IV, that the system fell within the hegemony's historical sphere of influence, and that the humans would withdraw their colony ships within 30 standard days, or face the consequences that came with defying a species that had been waging war since before humanity's ancestors had crawled out of their oceans. The conclave waited for the human response, and most of the delegates expected what always happened when a younger species was confronted by the Torvan, which was some combination of diplomatic backpedaling and face-saving compromise, because no one in their right mind picked a fight with the hegemony over a single star system. Ilara Voss stood up, and the amphitheater shifted its collective attention to her, and she looked very small standing there in her simple dark suit, surrounded by hundreds of alien species, who were all larger and older and more powerful than her own. But she did not seem to notice or care about any of that. She thanked the hegemon for his statement and acknowledged the hegemony's long and distinguished history. And then she said in a voice that carried perfectly through the translation matrix, without a single waver, that humanity respectfully declined to withdraw from Verath 4, and that the colony would remain exactly where it was. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock, but something deeper, something closer to disbelief, because several of the elder race diplomats actually turned to look at each other, as if they needed confirmation that they had heard correctly. Culver's mandibles spread wide in what humans would later learn was the Torvan equivalent of a smile that promised violence, and he stepped forward to the edge of his platform and looked down at the human ambassador and asked her if she understood what she had just done. Alara said that she understood perfectly. Culver nodded slowly, and then he invoked the oldest law in Torvan culture, older even than the conclave itself, a law that the hegemony had written into the founding charter as a condition of their membership, and that law was the trial of supremacy, a ritual of single combat between champions of two disputing species, in which the winner's claim was recognized as absolute, and the loser's species forfeited all rights to the contested territory permanently. The conclave erupted in noise as dozens of species began talking at once, because the trial of supremacy had not been invoked in over 2 centuries, and the last species that had faced a Torvan champion in the arena had lost so badly that they had voluntarily withdrawn from 3 additional systems out of pure shame. Alara waited for the noise to die down, and every diplomat in the room watched her face for some sign of fear or regret, or the dawning realization of what she had just walked into. And they found nothing, absolutely nothing, just that same steady calm that made them all so deeply uneasy. She said 2 words that would be replayed across every news network in the galaxy for months to come. "We accept." Culver stared at her for a long moment, and then he made his announcement, and his voice carried a weight that made the air itself feel heavier, because he declared that the hegemony's champion would be Drethker, the scourge of Alien, the most decorated warrior in Torvan history, a being who had fought 412 duels and killed every single opponent, a being who had personally ended a planetary rebellion by walking into the enemy capital alone and walking out 3 days later carrying the head of their king. The conclave fell into a silence so complete that you could hear the hum of the station's life support systems, and in that silence, every species present looked at the human ambassador and wondered the same thing. What kind of people hear a death sentence and simply say, "We accept," without even blinking? Alara Voss gathered her materials and walked out of the amphitheater with the same unhurried pace she had walked in with, and she did not look back, and she did not explain herself, and somewhere deep in the guts of the conclave station, the Torvan Honor Guard began sharpening their ceremonial blades, and the galaxy held its breath and waited. The message reached Earth 17 hours after the conclave session ended, and within 90 minutes of its arrival, the highest levels of the United Human Command were in a state of controlled panic that they were all pretending was calm strategic deliberation. Generals sat around a long table in a bunker buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps and argued with the kind of intensity that only people facing an impossible deadline and an alien death match could muster. And the arguments were loud and they were passionate, and they were absolutely going nowhere. General Hargrove wanted to send Captain Torres from the Orbital Strike Division, a woman who had been genetically augmented to the legal limit and could bench press a small vehicle, and had once killed an insurgent leader with a broken chair leg during an ambush on Titan Station. Admiral Chen countered with Commander Briggs, a cybernetic combat specialist whose nervous system had been rewired with military-grade processors and who could react to threats faster than most computers could register them. Colonel Webb suggested they skip humans altogether and send Ares 7, a combat artificial intelligence housed in a humanoid chassis that could move faster than the eye could track, and was technically classified as a weapon of mass destruction under 6 different treaties. They argued for 4 hours and might have argued for 4 more if the secure channel from the conclave had not chimed with a message from Ambassador Voss. And the message was short, and it was specific, and it ended the argument instantly because it contained a single name. Sergeant Major Jonas Mercer, retired. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the silence of deliberation, because this was the silence of recognition, the kind that settles over a group of military professionals when someone mentions a name that carries weight they cannot easily explain to anyone who has not served. General Hargrove was the first to speak, and what he said was simply, "Why him?" And his tone was not one of objection, but genuine curiosity mixed with something that sounded almost like discomfort. The intelligence officer who had pulled up the file cleared his throat and began reading from a record that was more redacted black bars than actual text, and what little was visible painted a picture that the room absorbed in heavy silence. Jonas Mercer had served through the entirety of the Collapse War, which was the name humanity had given to the decade-long global conflict that had nearly ended the species 40 years ago, a war that had killed 2 billion people and turned entire continents into wastelands and pushed civilization to the edge of extinction before a fragile peace was finally brokered by people who were too exhausted to keep fighting. He had enlisted at 19, and by 23 he was leading a company through the worst theater of the war, the Eastern European corridor, where the fighting was so brutal and so constant that the average life expectancy of a frontline soldier was measured in weeks, not months. Jonas Mercer had survived the entire thing. Not through augmentation, not through genetic enhancement, not through any of the technological miracles that the military had developed during those desperate years, but through something that the people who had served alongside him could never quite put into words, something they tried to describe in after-action reports and psych evaluations and late-night conversations in veterans' halls. And the closest anyone ever came was a medic named Rivera who had served with Jonas for 3 years, and who told a journalist after the war that being near Jonas in combat was like standing next to a mountain during a storm, because the storm raged and the lightning struck and the wind howled and the mountain did not care. It simply continued to be a mountain, and that was the most terrifying and the most comforting thing she had ever experienced. He had retired at 41 with more commendations than any living soldier and more classified operations on his record than most special forces units accumulated in a generation. And he had walked away from all of it without ceremony and without explanation, and had disappeared into the mountains of Patagonia, where he had built a small homestead with his own hands, and had lived alone ever since. The room studied his file and his photograph, which showed a man who looked exactly like what he was, which was a 54-year-old human being who had lived a very hard life and found peace on the other side of it, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes and hands that were rough from garden work, and a gaze that the camera had captured in a way that made several of the generals shift in their seats without knowing why. Hargrove asked again why Voss wanted this particular man and not one of the enhanced soldiers or the combat AI, and the intelligence officer pulled up a second message from the ambassador that contained her reasoning in a single paragraph. She wrote that the Torvan respected strength above all things, but that they had a very specific and very narrow definition of strength that was entirely about physical dominance and killing power, and that if humanity sent a bigger monster to fight their monster, then win or lose the galaxy, would simply categorize humans as another aggressive species competing on the same terms as everyone else, but that if humanity sent someone like Jonas Mercer, then the message would be different. And the message mattered more than the outcome, because the message was the whole point. The generals debated for another hour, but the decision had already been made the moment they read the name, because every person in that room understood on a level deeper than strategy and deeper than politics that Alara Voss was right, and that Jonas Mercer was the answer to a question the galaxy did not yet know it was asking. They sent the request through channels, and 3 days later, a shuttle landed on a flat stretch of ground near a homestead in Patagonia, where the Andes rose up like broken teeth against a sky, so blue it almost hurt to look at. And a young Navy lieutenant named Park stepped off the shuttle into cold mountain air and found Jonas Mercer kneeling in a garden with dirt on his hands, and a large rust-colored dog sitting beside him, watching the shuttle with mild interest. Jonas looked up at the lieutenant, and then at the shuttle, and then back at the lieutenant, and he did not seem surprised, which Park found more unsettling than if the man had pulled a weapon. Park delivered the briefing as professionally as he could, explaining the situation with the Torvan and the trial of supremacy and the champion called Drethker, and he handed over a tablet containing everything humanity's intelligence services had compiled on the scourge of Alien, including combat footage that showed the Torvan warrior tearing through opponents with a speed and savagery that made Park's stomach tighten every time he watched it. Jonas took the tablet and sat on his porch and watched the footage from beginning to end without expression, and the rust-colored dog, who Park would later learn was named Rust, put his head on Jonas's knee, and Jonas scratched behind the dog's ears absently while on the screen a 9-foot alien predator ripped a Challenger apart with its bare claws. When the footage ended, Jonas sat quietly for a long time, and the wind came down off the mountains, and the dog sighed, and somewhere in the valley below a bird called out and received no answer. Then Jonas stood up and went inside and came back 10 minutes later with a single bag over his shoulder, and he knelt down and spoke to the dog quietly, and a neighbor's truck appeared on the dirt road, as if this had all been arranged already, and the neighbor was an old woman who waved from the driver's seat, and the dog trotted over to her happily, and Jonas watched them go with the only expression Park had seen on his face so far, which was a softness around the eyes that vanished so quickly Park was not entirely sure he had seen it at all. They boarded the shuttle together, and as the craft lifted off and the homestead shrank below them and the curvature of the earth began to reveal itself through the viewport, Park worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in his throat since he landed. "Sir, are you nervous?" Jonas did not look away from the viewport where the stars were beginning to appear one by one against the darkening sky, and his reflection in the glass was a ghost overlaid on the universe. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet and even and carried the weight of a man who had long ago made his peace with every possible version of what might come next. "I stopped being nervous a long time ago." Park nodded and said nothing else for the rest of the flight, and the shuttle carried them both into the black, and the stars watched them go in silence the way stars always do, without judgment and without care, just light crossing the dark the same way it had since the beginning of everything. The arena of Kethsul hung in orbit above a dead gray moon like a crown made of iron and ancient stone, and it had been built 9,000 years ago by a civilization that no longer existed for the specific purpose of settling disputes between species who could not find peace through words. And in all those millennia, it had hosted over 6,000 trials, and the stones of its floor had been stained with the blood of more species than most galactic historians could name. On this day, the arena was filled beyond capacity with over 80,000 spectators from across the known galaxy, and millions more watched through broadcast networks that carried the signal to every inhabited world and station and outpost in civilized space, because the trial of supremacy between humanity and the Torvan hegemony had become the most anticipated event in galactic politics in over 2 centuries, not because anyone expected it to be competitive, but because everyone wanted to see with their own eyes just how badly the foolish young species from the spiral arm was about to be destroyed. The arena floor was a circle of dark stone roughly 200 meters across, scarred and pitted from thousands of years of combat, and it was surrounded on all sides by rising tiers of seating that climbed so high the uppermost levels disappeared into shadow, and the acoustics of the place were designed so that every sound on the arena floor carried to every seat with perfect clarity. Which meant that, when the Torvon champion made his entrance, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the entire structure, like the heartbeat of something massive and hungry. Drethger, the Scourge of Alien, walked through the eastern gate, and the crowd reacted with a sound that was part roar and part gasp, and part something that had no name in any language, because it was the sound that 80,000 beings made when they saw a living nightmare step into the light. He was enormous even by Torvon standards, standing just over 9 feet tall with a body that looked like it had been designed by a god who only understood violence, 4 arms thick with muscle, and covered in overlapping plates of dark chitin that gleamed like wet obsidian under the arena lights, and each arm ended in a hand with claws that curved inward like meat hooks, claws that had opened the throats of 412 opponents across a career of ritual combat that spanned 3 decades. His face was a horror of mandibles and deep-set eyes that burned with an amber light, and above his skull rose a crest of bony spikes that added another foot to his already impossible height. And when he opened his mandibles wide and roared his challenge to the arena, the sound was so deep and so loud that several of the smaller species in the audience physically recoiled, and one Velthari diplomat later admitted that she had temporarily lost control of her lower tentacles. Drethger performed the traditional Torvon war display with the confidence of a being who had never known defeat, and the display was not subtle, because he crossed to one of the stone pillars that lined the arena floor, pillars that were each 3 feet thick and made of compressed mineral composite harder than concrete, and he struck the nearest one with a single blow from his primary arm, and the pillar exploded into fragments that scattered across the arena floor like shrapnel. And then he turned and carved deep gouges into the stone beneath his feet with his claws, leaving trenches in the rock as easily as a human might drag a finger through wet sand. The crowd roared its approval, and the Torvon delegation in the upper tiers beat their fists against their chests in rhythmic unison, and the sound was like thunder rolling across a battlefield. And in the VIP section, Hegemon Culver watched with his arms folded, and his expression carrying the satisfied certainty of someone who already knew how this story ended. Then the western gate opened, and the arena fell silent. Not gradually, but all at once, the way sound dies when something unexpected happens, and every brain in the room needs a moment to process what it is seeing. Jonas Mercer walked through the gate alone. He wore no armor, carried no weapon, and displayed no technology of any kind, just a plain gray combat uniform with sleeves rolled to the elbows and standard military boots and nothing else, and he walked with the unhurried pace of a man crossing his own yard, not the stride of a warrior entering the most dangerous arena in the galaxy. The silence held for 3 seconds, and then it broke into a confused murmur that rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass, because every species present had expected something, some kind of human war machine, or augmented super soldier, or powered exoskeleton, or at the very least a very large and very angry young human in peak physical condition. And instead they were looking at a man in his mid-50s, who was average height and average build with gray at his temples, and a face that showed every year it had lived. In the broadcast booth, the commentators, a pair of Crescent analysts who had covered trial combat for decades, stumbled over each other trying to make sense of what they were seeing, and one of them said something that would later become the most quoted line of the entire event when he blurted out, "Is this the champion, or did someone's grandfather wander onto the arena floor by mistake?" Drethger stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by the rubble of the pillar he had destroyed, and he watched the human approach, and his mandibles clicked in a pattern that the Torvon in the audience recognized as deep and genuine insult. Because to send an old and unaugmented human against the greatest warrior the hegemony had ever produced was either the most profound act of disrespect in the history of interspecies relations or the most spectacular act of stupidity. And Drethger could not decide which one it was. He roared at Jonas, and the sound hit the human like a physical force, A wall of noise and fury that was designed by evolution to trigger the panic response in every prey animal on the Torvan homeworld. A roar that had made hardened warriors of other species freeze in terror and soil themselves and beg for mercy before the fight had even begun. Jonas did not flinch, did not blink, did not break stride. He walked to the center of the arena and stopped roughly 15 meters from the Torvan champion, and then he stood still, his hands open and relaxed at his sides, his weight settled evenly on both feet, his breathing slow and steady, and he looked up at Drethger the way a man might look at a thunderstorm rolling in over the mountains, with awareness and respect, but without any trace of the fear that every other being in the arena expected to see. Drethger spoke through the translation matrix, and his voice was loud enough for the entire arena to hear, as he declared that he had expected the humans to at least pretend to take this seriously, and that he was insulted by their choice of champion, and that out of pity for the old creature standing before him, he would make the kill quick and clean as a gesture of mercy to a species too stupid to know when it was beaten. Jonas said nothing. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the Torvan, and the arena waited for him to respond or to draw a hidden weapon or to do anything at all that would explain why humanity had sent this man to face a god of war. He did none of those things. He breathed in and he breathed out, and the absolute stillness of his body was so complete and so unnatural that it began to register on the crowd not as passivity, but as something else entirely, something that none of them had a word for yet, but that they could feel in the back of their minds like a sound just below the threshold of hearing. The official's horn sounded to mark the beginning of combat, and Drethger shifted into his fighting stance, all four arms raised, claws extended, weight forward, ready to close the distance in a single explosive burst of speed that had ended hundreds of lives in less time than it took to scream. Jonas did not move. He did not raise his hands, did not shift his weight, did not adopt any recognizable fighting posture from any species in the galactic database, and the commentators went silent because they had nothing to say, and the crowd went silent because they had nothing to compare this to. And somewhere in the VIP section, a Velthari elder who had been alive for over 600 years leaned forward in her seat, and her eyes went wide, and she whispered something to her aide that made the aide's skin change color in alarm. The elder had said 3 words in the old Velthari tongue, and translated into common, they meant something close to "he is waiting." And on the arena floor Jonas Mercer stood perfectly still and looked at the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy, with eyes that held something the cameras caught, but the commentators could not name, something older than courage and deeper than calm, something that had been forged in a furnace that the rest of the galaxy could not imagine. And the arena held its breath, and the galaxy held its breath, and the only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of a human heart beating without urgency in the silence of 9,000 years of blood-soaked stone. 30 seconds passed, and then a minute, and then 2 minutes, and the human did not move, and the Torvan champion did not charge, and the arena existed in a state of suspended disbelief that grew heavier with every heartbeat. Drethger circled to the left, his massive body moving with the fluid grace that made the Torvan so terrifying in combat, because something that large should not be able to move that quietly, and he kept his primary arms raised, and his secondary arms low and ready, and his amber eyes locked on the human who stood in the center of the arena like a statue carved from something the universe had forgotten how to break. He feinted forward, a sharp explosive half-lunge designed to trigger a flinch response, and the crowd gasped, and several spectators in the lower tiers physically jerked backward in their seats, but the human did nothing, did not shift his weight, did not raise his hands, did not even blink, and Drethger pulled back and circled again, and something in the way he moved had changed, something subtle that only the most experienced combat observers in the audience noticed. Because there was a hesitation in his step that had not been there before. In the Torvon delegation, Box Culver leaned forward in his seat, and his mandibles tightened in a way that his guards recognized as the first sign of concern they had ever seen on their hegemon's face. In the broadcast booth, the commentators had given up trying to narrate and were simply watching in silence along with the rest of the galaxy. In the Velthari section, the elder named Savith had closed her outer eyes and opened her inner ones, the ones that perceived not light but the electromagnetic patterns of living minds, and what she saw when she looked at the human made her grip the arms of her seat hard enough to crack the composite material. She turned to her aide and spoke in a voice that trembled not with fear but with awe, and she said that the human's mind was not quiet, that it was the opposite of quiet, that beneath the stillness of his body there was a fire burning so hot and so controlled that it had become invisible, like a star that had collapsed into itself and become something denser and more dangerous than it had ever been when it was bright. And she said that the human was not standing still because he was passive or because he was afraid or because he did not know what to do, but because he was choosing, actively and deliberately and with full awareness in every single moment, not to kill. The aide asked what she meant, and Savith said that she had lived for 612 years and had touched the minds of warriors from 30 different species, and she had never, not once, felt anything like what was inside this human, because every warrior she had ever encountered carried their violence on the surface where it could be seen and measured and predicted. But this human had taken his violence and buried it so deep and wrapped it in so many layers of control that it had become something else entirely, something that did not have a name in any language she knew. She said the closest she could come to describing it was that the human was like a blade that had been sheathed so long that everyone had forgotten it was a blade. But the blade had not forgotten what it was. The blade remembered every single thing it had ever cut. On the arena floor, Drethger made another pass, and this time he came closer, close enough that his claws passed within arm's reach of the human, and still Jonas did not move, and Drethger snarled in frustration, and the snarl echoed off the ancient stones, and the crowd shifted uneasily, because they were beginning to understand that something was happening here that they had no framework to comprehend. The Torvon delegation began shouting from their box, demanding that the human fight or forfeit, and their voices were angry and confused in equal measure. But the rules of the trial were absolute and had been written into galactic law 9,000 years ago, and the rules were clear. Combat ended when one party yielded or was killed or was incapacitated, and there was no clause anywhere in those ancient laws that said a combatant was required to attack. Drethger circled again, and this time he slowed, and he studied the human with the focus of a predator who was beginning to realize that something about this prey was wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong, in a way that his instincts were screaming about but his conscious mind could not yet identify. He had fought 412 opponents from dozens of species, and every single one of them had shared certain things in common regardless of their biology, because every living creature in the galaxy that had evolved to survive carried a fear response, a set of involuntary signals that broadcast their emotional state whether they wanted to or not, elevated breathing and muscle tension, and the chemical signatures of stress, and the subtle shifts in posture that telegraphed the intent to fight or to flee. The human had none of these. Not suppressed, not hidden, not masked by training or discipline, but genuinely absent, as if the part of this creature that was supposed to be afraid had been burned away by something so thorough and so total that it had not grown back, and what remained in its place was not emptiness but something else, something that Drethger's predator brain recognized on a level deeper than thought, something that made a very old and very buried part of his biology send a signal he had never received before in his entire life. The signal said, "This one is dangerous in a way you do not understand. Do not let the stillness fool you. Do not let the soft body fool you. Do not let the age fool you. Because what is standing in front of you did not survive by being the biggest or the fastest or the strongest. It survived by being something that the universe could not kill no matter how hard it tried. Drethger shook off the feeling and roared, and the roar was different this time, less performance and more genuine, a sound torn from somewhere deep inside him, and then he charged. He crossed the distance in less than a second, all four arms extended, claws spread wide enough to bisect a being twice the human size, and the arena erupted in a sound that was equal parts excitement and horror, because this was it. This was the moment. The human was about to die. Jonas shifted his weight. That was all he did, a half step to the right and a slight turn of his left shoulder, a movement so small and so economical that the spectators in the upper tiers did not even see it happen. But the result was that Drethger's primary claw, the one that could punch through starship armor, passed within 2 inches of the human's chest and hit nothing but air. Drethger's momentum carried him past, and he spun with a speed that should have been impossible for something his size, and he struck again with his secondary arms. A scissoring attack that came from both sides simultaneously, and Jonas leaned back, just leaned, not jumped or dodged or rolled, but simply tilted his upper body backward by a few degrees, and the claws crossed through the space where his throat had been a quarter of a second earlier and clicked against each other with a sound like 2 swords meeting. The crowd went completely silent. Drethger attacked again, a rapid combination of strikes that used all 4 arms in sequence, each blow faster and more vicious than the last, and Jonas moved through them the way water moves around stones, with the absolute minimum of motion required to not be where the claws were landing, a tilt of the head here, a shift of the hips there, a half step that seemed to anticipate exactly where the next blow would fall before it was thrown. He never raised his hands, never made a fist, never struck back, never even seemed to be trying particularly hard, and the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the greatest warrior the Torvan hegemony had ever produced threw everything he had at a 54-year-old human who moved like he was walking through his garden on a quiet Sunday morning. The replay analysts would later slow the footage down to frame by frame, and they would discover something that made them go very quiet, because Jonas Mercer's eyes were not reacting to the attacks as they happened. His eyes were fixed on Drethger's center mass, and they were not moving, which meant that the human was not dodging on reflex, but rather reading the Torvan's body mechanics with such complete understanding that he knew where every strike would land before the muscles that threw it had finished contracting. He had mapped the Torvan champion's entire combat pattern in the time he had spent standing still. Then Drethger stopped. He stood 3 meters from the human, all 4 arms hanging at his sides, his massive chest heaving with breaths that came too fast, and he looked at Jonas and Jonas looked back at him, and what passed between them in that moment was something that no camera could capture and no commentator could describe. Drethger saw it now, the thing the Velthari elder had seen, the thing that had been there all along hiding behind those quiet human eyes, and it was not aggression, and it was not defiance, and it was not the cold efficiency of a trained killer. It was something much worse than any of those things. It was familiarity. This human knew violence the way a fish knows water, not as something external that happened to him, but as the medium he had existed in for so long that it had become part of his chemistry. And he had not come to this arena to prove he could fight, because fighting was not something he needed to prove. Fighting was something he had done so much of and for so long and in such terrible circumstances that it had become as natural and as unremarkable to him as breathing. And the only reason he was still alive was not because he was talented at it, but because he had simply refused, with a stubbornness that bordered on the insane, to allow the universe to take him off his feet. Drethger had been built for war, engineered by evolution on a death world to be the perfect killing machine, but the human standing in front of him had been built for something worse. He had been built for survival in a world that had tried to destroy itself, and he had walked through the fire and come out the other side still standing, and the fire had not made him harder or stronger or faster. It had made him still. The kind of still that only comes when you have seen everything there is to see, and nothing can surprise you anymore. The scourge of Alien dropped to one knee. The sound that rippled through the arena was not a gasp, but something closer to collective exhale, as if 80,000 beings had all been holding their breath without realizing it, because in Torvan culture kneeling before an opponent was not surrender. It was something far more significant. It was the acknowledgement of a superior will, a declaration that the being before you possessed something that transcended physical strength, and it was the rarest and most sacred gesture a Torvan warrior could make. Then Drethger did something that no one expected. He laughed. It started low and deep in his chest, and built into a rolling thunder that shook dust from the ancient stones. And it was not the laugh of mockery or bitterness, but the laugh of genuine joy, the laugh of a warrior who had spent 30 years searching for something worthy, and had finally found it in the last place he ever expected to look. He spoke through the translation matrix, and his voice carried to every corner of the arena and to every screen and speaker across the galaxy. And what he said was simple, and it was honest, and it carried the weight of a warrior's respect given freely and without reservation. Now I understand why the galaxy is afraid of you. And Jonas Mercer stood in the center of that ancient arena and looked down at the kneeling giant, and the expression on his face was not triumph, and was not pride, but was something much quieter than either of those things, something that looked almost like sadness, as if he wished that the understanding Drethger had just reached was something the universe had never needed to teach anyone at all. The galaxy did not sleep that night, and in the days that followed, the footage from the arena of Kethsul spread across every network and every world and every station with the speed and force of a shockwave, and it left behind a silence that was not the silence of shock, but the silence of species trying to rearrange everything they thought they knew about the soft-bodied, short-lived creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The analysts were the first to try to explain what had happened, and they failed spectacularly, because every framework they applied to the footage fell apart under the weight of what they had witnessed, and the military experts from a dozen species could not agree on whether the human had demonstrated a martial technique so advanced that it was beyond their comprehension, or whether he had demonstrated no technique at all, and that was somehow worse. The Crescent Combat Institute published a paper within 48 hours that attempted to classify Jonas Mercer's movements during the fight, and concluded after extensive analysis that the human had not been using any identifiable fighting style from any known species, but had instead been operating on something the paper's authors called predictive stillness, which they defined as the ability to read an opponent's physical mechanics with such totality that evasion became not a reaction but a foregone conclusion. And the paper ended with a note that the authors found deeply troubling, which was that this ability did not appear to be the result of any genetic advantage or technological enhancement, but rather the product of sustained exposure to life-threatening combat over a period of years, which meant that any human who had survived similar conditions might be capable of the same thing. The Velthari elder Savith gave a single interview to a neutral press agency in which she described what she had perceived of the human's mind, and the interview was translated into 400 languages and read by billions of beings across the galaxy. And the part that people quoted most often was her statement that the human had not been at peace in that arena, that what she had felt radiating from his mind was not tranquility, but a violence so thoroughly mastered that it had become indistinguishable from calm. The way a river that has been dammed does not stop being a river. It simply becomes a lake, and the water remembers that it used to be wild even if the surface looks like glass. The Torvan hegemony formally ceded the Varath 4 system 3 days after the trial, and the manner in which they did so surprised everyone, because there was no bitterness in the declaration, and no resentment, and no promises of future retribution. And instead, the hegemon's official statement included a phrase that had never before appeared in any Torvan diplomatic communication in recorded history, which was a formal acknowledgement of humanity as a kindred species of the deep fire, a term from ancient Torvan mythology that referred to beings who had been forged in suffering so extreme that they emerged as something fundamentally different from what they had been before. Culver the Undying requested a private audience with Ambassador Voss, and it was granted, and the two of them sat across from each other in a small room aboard the Conclave station, the 9-foot predator and the human woman in her dark suit, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then Culver asked the question that had been consuming him since the moment his greatest champion had dropped to one knee before a creature a third his size. And the question was simple, and it was honest, and it carried the genuine confusion of a warrior king who had built his entire civilization around the principle of physical supremacy, only to discover that supremacy meant something he had never considered. He asked what humanity had done to Jonas Mercer to make him what he was. Alara looked at the hegemon for a long moment, and when she answered her voice was quiet and carried a weight that surprised even her, because the answer was not one she had planned or rehearsed, but one that came from somewhere deeper than strategy. She said that humanity had not done anything to Jonas Mercer specifically, that what the galaxy had witnessed in the arena was not the product of a program or a training regimen or a weapon development initiative, but was instead the product of what humanity had done to itself, because the Collapse War had not been fought against an alien enemy or an existential threat from beyond the stars, but had been fought by humans against humans, brother against brother and mother against daughter. For reasons that seemed critically important at the time and seemed incomprehensibly stupid in hindsight, and that war had lasted 10 years and killed 2 billion people, and it had very nearly been the end of everything. She said that Jonas Mercer had walked into that war as a teenager and had walked out of it as something else, and that the something else was not a weapon and was not a soldier and was not a hero, but was simply a man who had survived something that should have been unsurvivable, and that the stillness the galaxy had witnessed was not a skill but a scar, the scar left behind when a human being absorbs so much violence and so much loss that the part of them which knows how to be afraid simply goes quiet. Not because the fear is gone, but because there is nothing left that fear can threaten that has not already been threatened. Culver was silent for a very long time after she finished, and then he said something that Alara would remember for the rest of her life, because he said that the Torvan had always believed that the strongest warrior was the one who could inflict the most damage, but that the human had shown Drethker something that the Torvan had no cultural framework to understand, which was that the strongest warrior might instead be the one who has endured the most damage and chosen to keep standing, and that this was a form of strength that frightened him more than anything he had ever encountered because it could not be beaten, it could not be matched, it could only be witnessed and respected. He asked how many humans like Jonas Mercer existed. Alara did not answer, and her silence said more than any number could have. The conclave moved on to other business in the weeks that followed, but the ripples of what had happened continued to spread, and the way the elder races looked at humanity shifted in ways both subtle and profound, because they had expected the young species to be aggressive or clever or technologically resourceful, and all of those things were true. But the thing that no one had expected was the depth of humanity's relationship with suffering. The way they carried their trauma not as weakness, but as a kind of terrible wisdom. The way they had learned through millennia of doing horrible things to each other that the ultimate form of strength was not the ability to destroy, but the ability to endure. And on a quiet homestead in the mountains of Patagonia, the shuttle landed on the same flat stretch of ground it had departed from 2 weeks earlier, and Jonas Mercer stepped off into the cold mountain air, and the first thing he saw was Russ bounding toward him from the neighbor's truck with his tail going in circles, and his whole body vibrating with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a dog who had missed his person. Jonas knelt down, and the dog crashed into him and licked his face, and Jonas wrapped his arms around the animal's neck and held on, And if the young lieutenant watching from the shuttle door thought he saw the old soldier's shoulders shake for just a moment, he had the good sense to look away and say nothing. The neighbor waved from her truck and drove off, and Jonah stood up and looked around at the mountains and the valley and the garden that needed tending and the sky that was turning gold with the late afternoon sun. And he breathed in the cold air that tasted like earth and pine and distance. And somewhere out there beyond the sky, and beyond the stars, and beyond everything, he could see the galaxy was rewriting its understanding of what it meant to be human. Jonas Mercer did not know about any of that and would not have cared if he did, because the galaxy's opinion of humanity was a problem for ambassadors and generals and politicians, and he was none of those things. He was just a man who had been through a very long war and had come out the other side, and had built a quiet life in a beautiful place, and wanted nothing more than to live it. He picked up the watering can that was sitting where he had left it on the porch railing 2 weeks ago, and he walked into his garden with Russ trotting at his heels. And the tomatoes had gotten leggy in his absence, and the beans needed staking, and there was work to do, the good kind of work, the kind that built things instead of breaking them. The sun went down over the Andes, and the stars came out one by one, and among them were the worlds and stations and ships of a galaxy that was still trying to understand what it had seen in that arena, still trying to find the right word for the kind of strength that does not need to raise its hand to prove it exists. They would not find the word, because it did not exist in any alien language. In the human language it had many names, but the simplest one was the one that Jonas Mercer lived every single day without thinking about it, the one that did not require an arena or an audience or a chance